Thank you. So I thought the gig was that I would follow like a failed Skype connection and we'd all be making awkward conversation for 30 minutes. Instead, it's a goddamn revolution, which makes it hard. My original title was Cephalopods, can they do the next era of cat pictures? But in deference to Umer's talk, I've quickly changed that on my phone to who is building the institutions of the 21st century. It sounds rather dull, but there you go. I'm really interested in the fact that many old institutions and old companies didn't begin with one-dimensional goals. They certainly didn't set out to accumulate cash and hoard cash in the way that companies seem to do today. There's a great Wikipedia page of the oldest companies around. They go right back to the 6th century. And what's interesting about them is that they seem to have, first of all, a lot of them are German or Japanese, which I find interesting from a cultural point of view, looking at the economy today. But also they were often connected with mastery or purpose. They're not, hedge funds, for example, and they're not conglomerates that just try and, sell us plastic crap under different brand names. It's a really interesting starting point if you want to develop a critique of corporate operations today. And I think there's a reason why capital accumulation wasn't their primary goal for a long period of time. There are many reasons, but I think one reason is that money is entirely a relative and social construct, and that for large periods of its history, you couldn't actually accumulate it because it went down in value over time. So if you look at the late medieval period, for example, you look at the behaviors of the traders in Ragusa or Venice or Genoa, etc., they were people who pursued a mixture, a blend of status, power, influence, improving their kind of communities, probably war as well, in addition to wealth. And that's why we got, beautiful cities like Dubrovnik today, which cost, even in those days, a fortune to build, but they're so resilient and so well built that we can walk around them today, hundreds of years later, which is really interesting. And if you contrast that with the goals of, a hedge fund manager or a leading kind of CEO today, it's just really that they don't live anywhere. They don't have a community. There's no one that can knock on their door and say, oh, the village needs a new roof for the church. They buy yachts, they're hyper-global, and they really live for themselves. And I think that's partly what Umer was talking about. There are, of course, a variety of ways in which we can measure value. This is a kind of Google Earth shot of a small town in Germany called Gütersloh. And Gütersloh is the headquarters of Bertelsmann, the big German media group, which has been around for certainly most of the 20th century and now into the 21st. What I find interesting about this is that, you've got this situation where the town is really quite small, and actually all this area to the right is kind of Bertelsmann. So Bertelsmann really dominates this town, but dominates it in a symbiotic way. In other words, they have chosen to be located where they began, and they realize that they have a responsibility towards the community, and there's an ecosystem of workers, related companies, secondary industries, which works really, really well together. And if you ask people in the town, they're pretty happy that Bertelsmann is there, and they think that Bertelsmann does, on the whole, responsible things. You can look at an aerial view of Stuttgart, and you'll see the impact of Bosch. You can look at Munich, and you'll see the impact of Siemens. You can look at Herzogenaurach and see the impact of Adidas. It's a different situation to Anglo-Saxon capitalism in the sense that these companies still make stuff, and they still exist in a place. And I think that's a really interesting starting point. But there are other objectives, employment, jobs, the existence of a middle class, the absence of social conflict. All of these are perfectly valid goals for us to have individuals, but they're also perfectly valid goals for businesses as well, because they are part of what makes things sustainable over the long term. I mean, we've got to the stage now where, even in the Financial Times, this is earlier this week, I think, they're saying, save business from the businessman. It's a recognition that there is fundamentally an ethical and moral crisis, kind of a vacuum at the heart of management philosophy in certainly Anglo-Saxon capitalism today. And they find themselves saying things like, corporate insiders should be held to a more nuanced principle than unbounded self-interest. Business leaders should be ambitious for the companies, but not just greedy for themselves. And what that points to is not just an ethical issue, but a fundamental structural problem we have as well, which is the nature of public companies in particular is so flawed and so broken that the interests of the shareholders is not represented even by the management. You know, the management fleece them to the end of the earth in terms of their pay, their discretionary pay, their bonuses and everything else. And they're not actually creating value. What they're doing is they're gaming a system that's all about quarterly results and the impact on stock price. And when you put this into a context of the kind of innovative tech sector and you realize that the dream of every tech company like Twitter yesterday is to IPO, then that's a really worrying thought. What extra value does Twitter's IPO bring to the company or to its customers? It's simply a financial exercise in which all the founders get rich, the investors get rich, they raise some cash, and they play a game with the stock price. It doesn't make them a better company necessarily. It can, but it largely doesn't. Clayton Christensen is a really interesting guy. So he writes about innovation and the innovator's dilemma and stuff. He has a current thesis about the damaging role that financial orthodoxy in the financial system is having on business. And he says, once upon a time, we used to spend a lot of money and create loads of jobs by generating empowering, disruptive innovations. And then we'd go through a cycle of sustaining them and then eventually making them more efficient by reducing the labor component, reducing the cost, and freeing up cash. The idea was that that cash would then flow back in to creating more empowering innovations, and that's how the economy worked, and that's how innovation contributed to value creation. But the problem is that CFOs and business schools and MBAs and everyone that just works from a spreadsheet said, well, that's nuts. Why do we want to free up cash and then put it into a risky innovation scheme? Why don't we just hoard the cash? We don't need workers, we can lower costs, and we can just keep squeezing and squeezing the efficiency play until there's nothing left. And that is a really frightening phenomenon. And certainly Clayton Christensen thinks that is very, very damaging in terms of the future of value creation today. So if we look at startups, are startups a way out of this? Are they a solution to this problem? Or are they just a financial product that exists to be traded by venture capitalists with a dream of going to IPO and becoming a publicly traded company? VCs are unicorn hunters. They make their money from approximately 0.07% of funded deals that go through. Right? So there have been about 39 companies in the last 10 years that achieved sort of billion-dollar valuations. And then there are occasional super unicorns like Facebook that are $100 billion companies. That's where they make their money. They don't make their money by turning all of your wonderful youths with their brilliant ideas into sustainable organizations or sustainable businesses. Yeah? They don't really care whether they live or die. What they care about is how many of them can get to A round, become a billion-dollar company, and then we achieve super returns. And that's a real problem. It's such a problem that it leads to a situation where companies with no revenues, no profits whatsoever, like Pinterest and Snapchat, are looking at $4 billion valuations. It's such a distortion on the logic of economics and the logic of business that I really worry for the motivational impact that has on young people trying to create something or build something today. It's a kind of crazy system. And unfortunately, the startups are part of this. They're willing participants in this system because the dream of many startups is, create the company, sell it to Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft, and then they basically shut it down. But you get the money, okay? So you do well, but the company ceases to exist. Doppler, really beautiful product, really beautiful tool. I really miss it. I used to use it a lot. This is my 2008 annual report of traveling with Doppler. But, Nokia decided they wanted Marco Artisari back. And so they're willing to pay a sum of money to acqui-hire members of the Doppler team. They don't give a toss about Doppler. Doppler sat there doing nothing for a few years, and then it was finally closed down recently. It's a shame. You can look at Yuri Engström and his acquisition of Yaiku with Google. Yuri's a super smart guy. I have absolute respect for him. He created a Twitter before Twitter. It was pretty brilliant. It was a European company. Google bought it, did nothing with it, and then shut it down. This story goes on and on and on, and I think that's not the dream that many of us get into this for, and it shouldn't be the dream of startups today. But there's also a related problem, which is that even startups that have a real goal of creating a sustainable organization, they get to this point where when they're about 20 or 25 people, they think, oh, shit, we need to grow up, okay? So we need a douchebag sales guy somebody who's a complete tosser, who can go out there wearing a suit and just smarm people to death. We need a sociopathic CEO, and we need a CFO who we all secretly hate and secretly hates us. And then we have an org chart, yeah? And then we can be a grown-up corporation just like our moms and pops were. And it's a real shame. They have this inbuilt belief that in order to scale, they have to become like the companies they're disrupting. And what I want to say, and I think what Omer was talking about as well, is that that doesn't have to be the case. It really does not have to be the case. But where does it begin? I think the problem begins with a lack of innovation around organizational design and organizational structure. And that's the kind of boring, nerdy bit that I want to bore you to death with for the next 10 minutes or so. So, we have this myth, this idea of scientific management, Frederick Taylor, et cetera, the only way to coordinate over large distances and in large numbers of people is the cascading hierarchy, and we can get more outputs from each unit of labor by beating them harder or giving them some more cash or whatever it might be. But in reality, the way that work takes place is like this. It's organic, it's messy, it's a series of interleaved networks and connections and so on and so forth. The fact that we persist in designing organizations around this cascading hierarchy is just the most ultimate stupidity. And I think even mainstream publications now are saying, look, we've got to stop. This is really idiotic. It doesn't add value. It doesn't even make any sense. It doesn't even support the past, let alone the present or the future. And I think that's a good thing that we're recognizing that we need to move beyond that. And I'll try and show you one or two alternatives to that in a second. But I think also there's this problem that we're too focused on the appearances of doing business rather than actual value creation. So, why do they wear a suit? Why do they wear the financial guys wear these funny socks? They always have, that's their individualism. They wear like different colored socks, which is like really, really cool. And, you go to a meeting and you sit down and you say the right buzzwords and you blue sky think and you do all this stuff. Whereas startups, they just do things, yeah? They just focus on roles and tasks and creating value and making things because they don't have the money or the time to screw around with all the rest of the stuff. And this is a big issue. We need to be professional. Startups, in many ways, are more professional than the corporates because they're not focused on appearances, because they're actually focused on trying to make something happen. It's kind of interesting that, going back to Ronald Coase had this theorem about transaction costs. He said, why does a firm exist? Well, a firm exists because within the firm, it can perform an action with lower transaction costs than it could outside the firm. And if it so happens that you can perform that action cheaper or better outside, then that is what will happen. Only things that can be done better inside the firm will happen inside the firm. Well, it turns out that that's not true. It's true in theory, but not in practice, because actually what really happens is that managers continue to accrete power and control way beyond any logical point where that makes sense for the company, the market, or indeed their customers. They value control more than they value, value creation, if you know what I mean. And you can see this in examples like Microsoft. I used to read all the kind of nerdy forums around mini Microsoft and debates about the company. And you see comments like, yeah, when you get to a level 68 project manager, they're really dumb. And you're like, what? 68 levels of project managers? What the hell is going on? Seriously, how can anyone hope to do anything with that level of bureaucracy? And there's a great piece in Vanity Fair and a number of others that say that the system that they focused on in the last few years, which is this stack ranking of employees, where everyone is constantly competing against each other, and the lowest are kicked out and the top are promoted, has basically cost them a decade of growth. They're stagnating. They have areas of super profitability, but actually the rest of the organization is doing rather badly in most areas. And it's not just Microsoft. This is a thread from Quora. It's a discussion of former Googlers recently, I think last week. And they talk about their experiences even in the much lauded sort of paradise that is Google. And the kind of things they say are, super political management structure, easy to get promoted if you know the right people, mediocre middle management, promotions to the senior levels are based on politics. This is classic corporate stuff. So just because they've discovered this sort of magic source of money, which is AdSense, and just because they've got all this cool stuff and hire some brilliant people, doesn't mean that they're immune from also repeating the same mistakes of every classic 20th century corporation. And I think that's a really kind of weird thing to think about Google. It comes back, I think, to this idea that, most companies, their goal is not free market competition. Yeah, this is a complete myth about capitalism. Their goal is monopoly. Their goal is control. Their goal is outsized power, outsized returns. If you're an oil company, your money comes out of a hole in the ground, right? You know that you can be profitable at, let's say, $40 a barrel. Well, guess what? The price is probably $100 a barrel. You'd have to be seriously stupid not to be a profitable organization in that situation. And so you get the situation where those involved in extraction and refining and everything else, they're the kind of the gods in the organization. And there's this entire bureaucracy around them that more or less doesn't matter much because that's not where the money comes from. And it's the same with Google, with AdSense, and it's the same with Microsoft with its sort of Office and Windows, sort of pretend monopolies as well. It's a really interesting thing. And actually, this is something that I think many people misunderstand when they're critiquing, capitalist organizations. But anyway, I digress. I'm also slightly behind. Organization, design, and structure are really important. I spent the last 10 years sort of banging my head against various brick walls, pushing the idea of social technology as a way of reforming large corporate structures. And we had a lot of influence. We had some success. We've worked with a lot of really good people, and we can point to some good things. But we really came to learn the limits of that. And the limits of that are culture, structure, and practice. If you don't change those, there's no amount of wikis and social networks and blogs and everything else in the world that is going to reform the performance of your organization. So more interesting than the tech is the new affordances that the technology brings into play. So earlier, I think Anne-Marie talked about collective intelligence being a way of sort of orchestrating labor and ideas within her organization at Just Giving. And you've got plenty of pieces like this McKinsey piece about how social intelligence can improve decision-making. Well, it's possible now because we have the tech to join everyone together. We can do prediction markets. We can do all these sort of ideation platforms and so on. But we need to reform management and management thinking to make that actually happen and to make it real. Otherwise, it's just a sort of a sideshow while the main branch of the organization continues. Luckily, we already have a bunch of alternatives in terms of models, templates, and case studies and so on. This is a diagram from a methodology called holacracy. Holacracy is a kind of pretty cool way of organizing teams to relate to teams that doesn't require any management at all. And there's a company called Medium, which is one of the successor companies to Twitter, set up by Ev. And Medium has this philosophy of managing without managers. And so there's a bunch of things. You can read up on it. I won't go into the detail. But it's an interesting approach. It doesn't mean it's the right approach for everyone, but it's one radically different alternative to cascading hierarchy based on managers. We heard earlier, the center is tired. And this is really a very good observation. It's absolutely true. The people running these systems do not believe that those systems work or are the best solution. But that's their job, to run those systems. And so they continue to do that until we lop their heads off. Actually, that was Omer. I was channeling Omer there. I don't actually believe in stuff like that. I'm not really Russell Brand. Rick talked about speed, trust, scalability, about goals, which are tangible, epic, and so on. These are really simple, very practical watchwords, for how you start to structure activity and pursue practical goals. And as I mentioned, Anne-Marie talked about collective intelligence being a way to crack problems. And then Mikel, in his brilliant sort of exposition of Mondragon, talked about how they have a explicit goal of creating wealth, which is not the same as extracting money. It's actually creating wealth in society through a process of solidarity. These are all great ideas, and these are happening already. Yeah? So these are not pie in the sky. These are already there. And if you go further back, there's a bunch of companies that have shown us that we can do this better and we can do this in a more interesting way. Hire, ironically, a competitor of Mondragon in white goods, and they're one of the reasons that they had to shut down the company he talked about in Spain. Hire was a state industry in China, and it produced absolutely rubbish products. And a manager came in, and he took the famous hammer, and he got them to line up an entire production output on the street, and in public he smashed them all to bits, even though customers were begging to pay double the cost to get them because supply was so short. And he said, from this day onwards, we're customer-centric, we do things a different way, and he inverted the entire organization so that every customer-facing function is important, and the further away from the customer you are, the less important you are in the organization. It's a very decentralized model. It's a very interesting and quite complex model. There's a really good book called Reinventing Giants that's a great case study of that company. You can look at Kyocera, not the most exciting tech company, pretty old generation of tech, printers and copiers and stuff like that. They have a radically decentralized structure. They call it amoeba management, where they have 3,000 plus teams of between 5 and 50 people operating semi-autonomously and making their own connections and their own links to get things done. Morningstar, a very basic agricultural company, one of the biggest tomato processors in California. Again, they had a problem where in the factory, the managers were, they just didn't know anything that would add value to the production process. So actually, they reorganized and had a kind of peer-to-peer structure where the workers would make the decisions, they would negotiate their own contracts with different parts of the organization, and they created a very interesting case study in autonomous self-management. And more recently, Valve, who do the Steam gaming platform, they are a really interesting case study. Their handbook, if you haven't read it, is really worth a read because they have no managers and they have these sort of wacky diagrams, how to work without a boss. Just get on with it. They have another one which is how to move your table. They say they're on wheels, lift it, move it, put it down, plug it in, go somewhere else, do something that you think is a better idea at the time. And that's literally what people are encouraged to do. And if you read their testimonies, they say it takes about 6 months for the workers to really get the reality that there genuinely is no one to tell them what to do. It's really interesting. So the thing is, white goods, old tech, agriculture, gaming, there's no one sector that these have in common. These are quite a diverse set of companies. So if they can do it, anyone can do it if they want to. But we go back to that question, do we really want to? Or do we want to just mimic the kind of so-called grown-up companies that we see when we're studying the case studies? I had this kind of conspiracy Keanu revelation. I don't know if any Redditors in the house, but a Reddit meme is sort of obligatory. What if startups are already more professional than the corporates, but they don't realize it yet? They think that because they wear T-shirts and they work with code and they do all this kind of stuff, somehow they're wacky, left field, not part of the mainstream. What if that's not true? I mean, when you look at this picture, this kind of barely suppressed homoerotic scene that in kind of clip art land represents the pinnacle of human achievement. This is professionalism in its purest form. I mean, a ladder, glass and steel, fake grass, suits. It doesn't get better than that. But what if these guys could actually learn something from startups? What would it be that they would learn? Well, first of all, on a really practical level, planning and project management in a startup is 100 times more professional than in a corporate. It's documented, it's agile, we use Trello boards, we use Kanban, we use a range of methodologies. And it has audit trails, it has professionalism, it has adaptability, and it can knock any corporate project management waterfall system into a cocked hat. Working in the open. Another Twitter alumnus set up a company called Square. In Square, very simple rule, any meeting of more than 2 people has to be documented for everybody to read, okay? Every board deck is available to everybody to read. It's just openness of information, that's all it is. It's nothing, there's not any kind of rocket surgery in there. But again, that's something that just improves operations, makes things more efficient, but corporates would never do it. DevOps. DevOps is this kind of amalgam of developers and the kind of operational IT side who have to run the stuff that developers build. DevOps are probably the most professional people in any organization I've ever come across. They document everything, they automate everything, they have real-time data about what's going on. If you actually see beyond the T-shirts and think of them as accountants or financiers or managers, you can see that anyone with that level of performance in a corporate will be doing really, really well. So DevOps are kind of, secret heroes in organizations, and they can teach corporates a thing or two. The Wiki way. We work in the open, and if you see something that's wrong, fix it, yeah? Not go and bitch to your boss, who bitches to their boss, who gets into a massive fight with someone else, who comes down and cuts your budget. You just go in and edit it. You just change it, yeah? It's a really simple approach. And finally, full circle, back to the idea of management. Medium I mentioned earlier, they have these sort of ideas and these sort of philosophies about how you can operate without management. So I think there's a lot that the startups have to teach us. So why the hell not? Why don't we just give it a shot, like Omer said? Why don't we try and create institutions that can last the next 100 years? The really interesting thing about institutions is that when they codify values and practices, they give them longevity. They protect them. Yeah? So the BBC was a great idea at the time. It would never be created today. And if it was destroyed, it will not be recreated today. Probably the oldest institution is, in Europe is the medieval universities. First one was in Bologna, 1088. Yeah? And from 1088 to today, there's an unbroken chain of this particular culture of learning and study in a place like a university, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that's quite an institution. And I know it sounds old-fashioned to celebrate institutions, but actually they can protect our ideas. They can take our practices, and they can still be happening 100 years from now, which is why I find them sort of interesting. So what would a post-20th century institution look like? Well, a friend of mine, Stowe, he would say it's more like a forest. You know, it's about cultivation of ecosystems and the appearance of chaos that leads to kind of emergent order rather than a priori planning and top-down management and so on. And I think that's interesting. It's, you know, it's a bit wordy. It's just a first shot as part of something he's writing. But also what it speaks to me about is resilience. So fractal structures are always, in nature, way more resilient than any other kind of structure. So that's why they're everywhere. And if you look at all of the case studies that I mentioned and the examples, what they all have in common is that the unit of analysis is the small team. It's what Amazon calls the two-pizza team, so you can feed a team with two pizzas. It's roughly, you know, depending on whether you're American or not, it's like one person, or about 12, about 12 people. Umair's not listening now, so it's fine. It's absolutely fine. So, you know, these small teams are the basic unit of operation in all of these decentralized and more autonomous organizations, and I think that's really interesting. Okay, so how do you go from 8 people to 300,000 people? Well, guess what? 4 levels of kind of indices, or the power of 2, et cetera, across 4 levels gets you from 8 people to about, you know, 250,000 people. You can build up fractal structures to make them scalable as necessary and very, very resilient. This is a diagram from a friend of mine, Dave Gray. He's got this book, The Connected Company. It's one of this great array of new management thinking, like Kotter and Steve Denning and everything else. It's a really interesting read, but that's really what it's based on, the idea that you can create podular companies that build up in a fractal way to create scale. I'm nearly done, I promise, but how do we get there from here? I think one of the great criticisms that people level at these ideas is, well, you know, we can't just, whatever it is, turn the oil tanker. And you're like, well, blow the oil tanker up with a torpedo, duh. But, you know, you do have to start from somewhere. And I think the first thing to say is that, you know, this is not a consultant-led change program. And it should never be labeled as such, because they just don't work. It's a load of crap. It's writing fake values and putting them on posters and going around and doing town hall meetings and all that stuff. It doesn't change anything. So it's not that. So where do you start? Another really interesting case study of this kind of organization is the UK Government Digital Service, GDS. It's kind of miraculous that Tom and Mike and all these guys have created this, this institution within the Cabinet Office, nominally, and within government, which is totally different, behaves in a totally different way, and creates products that are orders of magnitude better and cheaper than what we've done in the past. And what GDS have pioneered, I think, is the use of protected space. Yeah? So they were politically astute enough to know that they had to demand complete protection from the vagaries and the structures of the organization that hosted them in order to build a bit of resilience and prove their case before they could then take that out and start spreading it in other ministries and other departments and so on. The other thing they've done, of course, is, as this slide implies, is complete openness in terms of their own goals. Yeah? So they have live, real-time accounts of what they're doing well, what they're not doing well. But I think the notion of protected space is a really interesting starting point, and it's one that I'm kind of exploring more and more at the moment. And finally, leadership, as I think several people have said this today, but leadership is vitally important. It doesn't mean we're talking about the hero leader who has all the great ideas and does stuff, but actually creating the space in which these ideas can be pursued, encouraging people to step up and take control and take responsibility is vital. But management, as a practice, is not. Management can go away and we can still do all this stuff perfectly well. So finally, I guess, looking ahead, it's an ambitious and slightly arrogant thing to say that we can perhaps consider building these institutions, but Umer told you to do it. My job is just to give you some practical tips on how to get there. So I would say if we think of the future old firms, firms that are started today which are 100 or 150 years old into the future, what kind of characteristics will they have? I think, first of all, they will have explicitly blended goals, not just the pursuit of shareholder value or cash accumulation, which many organizations have today. I think they will have much better ecosystem thinking, because ecosystems reduce the overall costs in the market for all the players. So they create an environment in which different players can compete more successfully. And I think this combination of kind of social technology plus a new culture of work, a new conception of what work is, plus new structural design around organizations, that will really be at the heart of how better organizations look. And I think we should not be ashamed to pursue employment as a goal. You cannot have a society in which there is no middle class and there's only the billionaire kind of elite and then a bunch of people who are on the poverty line. It's not sustainable in any way. It's not good for business. It's not good for humanity. And so I think more situated businesses that have a more local relationship with their communities is also definitely part of the picture here. And finally, ownership models are really key to this. So we've seen Mondragon with an incredibly successful network of cooperatives. We've looked at, crowdfunding as something thrown in the mix. We've certainly seen the severe damage that public companies, IPO'd companies, et cetera, have on the economy. And I think also it's worth remembering that a lot of Europe's history is about family-owned businesses, actually. Businesses that exist for the long term, not just until the first trouble. So I think we'll see a more mixed and more nuanced approach to ownership models as well. So that's it. That's a little bit boring, I realize that, but just a few practical thoughts from my boss, Umer, to you this afternoon. So thank you very much. Cool.